Hello Year 4, it's Mrs Clues here to share some reading with you today. On Monday, Mrs Fowler read to you the first 2 chapters of Bill's New Frock, so I'm going to be reading chapters 3 and 4 to you today. If you want, pause the video now, go and get yourself a drink and maybe a nice snack if you're allowed, and then come and get snugly while we read the next 2 chapters of Bill's New Frock. I've got my cup of tea here too. Pink, pink, nothing but pink. After break, it was art. Everyone helped to unfold the large plastic sheets and lay them over the tabletops and spread old newspapers over them. Then Mrs. Collins sent Layla into the dark cupboard at the back of the classroom to see what was left in the art supplies box. Are there any coloured chalks left? No, they're all gone. Pastels then? They're still too damp to use after the roof leak. What about clay? It's all dried up. There must be crayons. Every class has crayons. The infants came and borrowed ours last week and haven't brought them back yet. Right then, it would just have to be paint as usual. So Layla dragged the heavy cardboard box full of paint tubs out of the cupboard, and everyone crowded round to choose their colours. Here's a pink. What's that one? Pink. More pink. Pink. I found some blue. Oh, no, I haven't. It's empty. I thought I'd found some green, but it's dried up. There's no white. There's never any white. We haven't had white for years and years. There's some pink here. And this one's pink. Pink, pink, nothing but pink. Everyone stood up, disappointed. Kirsty voiced everyone's disgust. What can you do with pink? She demanded. You can't paint pink dogs or pink space vehicles or pink trees or pink battlefields, can you? If you can only find one colour, it's difficult enough. But if you've only got pink, it's practically impossible. What is there in the world that's all pink? Yes, what's all pink? Everyone gazed around the room, looking for something that was all pink, so they could paint it. Some of them stared at the pictures and posters pinned on the classroom walls. Others gazed out of the window across the playground to the street and the shops. 1 or 2 of them glanced at one another, and Kirsty looked at Bill. No, Bill said. No, 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 not me. Absolutely not. You can't. Now everyone turned to look at Bill. No, Bill insisted. I am not all pink. Now Mrs. Collins too was inspecting Bill closely. Pink frock, she admitted slowly, and fiery hair, rich rosy freckles, and a nice deep plush. Yes, you'll do beautifully, dear. You're all pink. I am not pink! But he was getting pinker by the minute, and by the time everyone had wandered back to their seats, clutching their little plastic tubs of paint, you wouldn't have needed any other colour to do a really fine portrait of Bill. Perfect, said Mrs. Collins, and taking Bill Simpson firmly by the hand, she tried to lead him over towards a chair in the middle of the room, where everyone would be able to see him clearly while they were painting him. Bill tried to pull back. Mrs. Collins turned in astonishment at his unwillingness and let go of his hand quite suddenly. Bill staggered back straight into Nicky, who had just prized the top of his paint tub. A huge glob of pink paint flew up in the air and landed on Bill Simpson's frock. As everyone watched, it gathered itself, all fat and heavy at the bottom. Then slowly it slithered down between the folds of material, leaving a thick pink slug trail. Bill Simpson watched in silence as a small pool of pink paint appeared on the floor beside his left foot. Grubby fingerprints round the hem, a huge muddy smudge on the front, a great slimy paint smear down the side. What next? Mrs. Collins inspected the damage and shrugged. Well, never mind, she said. It's only poster paint. I'm sure the frock will wash out beautifully. And once again she took his hand. There was no fight left in Bill Simpson. Meekly he allowed himself to be led to the middle of the room. Mrs. Collins arranged him neatly and comfortably on the little wooden chair. There, she said triumphantly, placing a cherry-coloured exercise book in one of his hands as a last touch. All pink. She stepped back to admire her handiwork. Perfect, she said again. Now is everyone happy? Bill Simpson could have tried to say something then, but he didn't bother. He reckoned there was no point. He knew that whatever he said and whatever he did, this awful day would just keep sailing on in its own way, as if in a dream. A curse was on him, a pink curse. He was of all things haunted by a pretty pink frock with fiddly shell buttons. He might as well give up struggling. Like poor Rapunzel trapped in her high stone tower, he'd just sit quietly, waiting to see what happened, hoping for rescue. Meanwhile, the rest of the class had begun to complain. If we've only got pink to paint with, how are we supposed to do that great big football-shaped smudge on the front of his frock? It's brown. I can't paint all those grubby little fingerprints right round the hem of the dress. They're grey. Those shell buttons are a bit fiddly to paint. I've done far too many freckles. What shall I do? Wait till they're dry, then chips them off. Bill ignored everyone. He just sat there, waiting for time to go by. Even a bad dream can't last forever. His torment has to end sometime, surely. After half an hour or so, Mrs. Collins came by, carrying a fresh jar of water over to table 2. Do try to look not quite so gloomy, dear, she murmured in Bill's ear as she walked past. You're spoiling people's paintings. And Bill was too miserable and defeated even to bother to scowl back at her. Chapter 4, No Pockets. Perhaps Mrs. Collins noticed how fed up he looked. Perhaps she was grateful to him for sitting so still for so long and being so pink. Or maybe it was just Bill's eye she happened to catch first. But whatever the reason, it was Bill Simpson she chose to take her spare key back to the office. That's helpful of you, she said, pressing the key into his hand. Just give it to Mrs. Banderona. She's expecting it, and hurry back. Everyone else looked up from their maths books and watched enviously as he left the classroom and shut the door firmly behind him. Outside in the deserted corridor, one thought, and one thought only, was in Bill Simpson's mind. Lavatories. Silently he crept along. Should he turn left into the boys and risk hoots of catcalls and astonishment if anyone caught him there in his pretty pink frock? Or should he turn right into the girls, where a boy, even to be found hanging around the doorway, was to risk terrible trouble? Girls' lavatories were more private. At least he could struggle with the frock in peace. Bill made his choice. Peering back over his shoulder like some spy from an old black and white film, he scuttled hastily into the girls' toilets. When, 2 minutes later, he stuck his head back out through the swing doors, the corridor was still empty. Sighing with relief, Bill stepped out. He took his time now, dawdling along towards the school office, swinging the key from his fingers and stopping to peer at each painting on the wall. After his heart-stopping rush in and out of the girls' toilets, Bill reckoned that he'd earned a break. But just as he turned the corner, who should he see backing out of a cupboard but the head teacher? Bill Simpson started looking sharp. Lifting his chin, he walked a lot faster. He was almost safely past the head teacher when he was stopped. A hand fell on the top of his head. You look very sensible and responsible, the head teacher said. Not dawdling along, peering at all the paintings, taking your time. Are you going to take to the office an errand for your teacher? Would you do me a favour and take these coloured inks? And he held out a handful of tiny glass bottles. Bill put out his free hand, and the head teacher tipped the tiny glass bottles onto his outstretched palm. Whatever you do, don't drop them, he warned, and then he dived back in his cupboard. Bill went on. He'd hardly reached the short flight of stairs when the school nurse came up them the other way, carrying a pile of yellow forms in her arms and walking faster than most people run. Ah, she said, spotting Bill, just what I need. Someone who can take these medical forms to the office for me so I can rush straight across to the nursery before the bell rings. She didn't exactly ask. She didn't exactly wait to see if Bill minded. She just thrust the stack of yellow medical forms into his arms and hurried off. And they're in perfect alphabetical order, she called back over his shoulder. So whatever you do, don't drop them. Problem, thought Bill. One false move and everything would fall to the floor. Spare key, little glass ink bottles, medical forms in perfect alphabetical order, the lot. The key and the coloured inks would just have to go in his pockets. Pockets. Carefully, Bill squatted in the corridor and lowered the pile of yellow medical forms to the floor, taking care that he didn't lose the key or drop the glass bottles. Then he felt all around the pretty pink frock for a pocket. He pushed and shoved at frilly places here and there, wherever he thought there might be one hidden. But though he heard the material rip once or twice and felt his hands go through the holes he'd accidentally torn, there were no pockets. No, not one pocket. Acres of material, masses of it, pleats, frills, bows, scallops, fancy loops, but not one pocket. Whoever designed the dress had gone to all the trouble of matching the imitation lace around the hem with the imitation lace around the collar and fitting a zip in so neatly that it was practically invisible and putting comfortable elastic around the little puffy sleeves, but they just hadn't bothered to put a pocket in. Bill was amazed. How was a person in a frock like this supposed to survive? How were they expected to get along without any pockets? It can't have been the only dress of its kind that was made. Other people must wear them. Where did they put their money, for heaven's sake? Did they keep it all damp and hot and sticky in the palm of their hand all day? Where did they put their sweets from friends? What did they do if someone returned their pencil sharpener to them at break time? How can you live without pockets? How can you? Bill put his head in his hands and groaned. Then he tried to pull himself together. This couldn't last forever. This couldn't go on. No boy could turn into a girl and stay that way without anyone, even his mother and teacher and school friends, noticing any real difference. It must be a bad dream. It felt like a nightmare. He'd just keep calm and steady and wait till the horror of it was over. He'd just get on with the job in hand. And the job in hand was to get all these things safely to the school office. Bill gathered up the yellow medical forms. On top of them, he put the coloured inks right in the middle so they wouldn't roll off the edge and smash on the floor. He wedged the key between the ink so it would not slide off the side. Then, very carefully, he started down the corridor again towards the office. Before he'd gone a dozen steps, he heard a rapping on the nearest window. He turned to look. It was the caretaker. The caretaker leaned through the window. "Off to the office, are you?" he asked. "Do me a favour, take these tennis balls with you." And before Bill could argue, the caretaker tipped 7 tennis balls onto the carefully stacked pile in Bill's arms. Bill stood for a moment, steadying his load. He let the medical forms dip a bit in the middle to take a sort of hollow to keep the balls together and stop them rolling off over every side. Then, even more carefully than before, step by tiny, gentle step, he made for the office again. When he was only a short way away, he saw Mrs. Banderena lift her head from her computer, glance through the open doorway, and notice him shuffling towards her. Each step seemed to take forever. Everything in his pile seemed to be wobbling dangerously. Everything in his pile seemed to be sliding closer to the edge. "My," Mrs. Banderena said, watching his snail's slow progress, "aren't you the careful one, taking such care not to spill coloured ink on your sweet little frock?" It wasn't Bill's fault. It was because she said the words "sweet little frock." A shudder of pure fury rose through his body and made his hand shake. He didn't know the yellow forms were going to slip from his grasp and slither out of alphabetical order across the floor. He didn't know the little glass bottles would fall and smash. He didn't know the 7 tennis balls would bounce up and down in the bright coloured pools of spilt inks. He didn't know the spare key would end up submerged in a puddle of purple. Bill Simpson tried very hard not to narrow his eyes at Mrs. Banderena and blame her for everything as she slid off her office chair to help him. He tried very hard to look grateful as she swept a handful of tissues out of the box on her desk and help him mop and wipe and gather rainbow-spotted tennis balls. And he tried to look pleasant while she tipped the slivers of shattered glass into the wastebasket and helped him shuffle all the medical forms back into alphabetical order. But once back in the corridor again, and alone, he couldn't help muttering something quite rude and quite loudly about the sort of person who would design a pretty pink frog with no pockets and expect other people to go around wearing it. Okay, that's the end of chapter 4, so I'll leave it there, and next week Mrs. Cross will be reading a bit more for you. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that. Bye for now, guys.